morning, colleagues. I'm going to start the seminar now. I think people are still trickling in. Thank you so much for attending the first of 3 seminars that support the NRF 2021 rating and evaluation call. So today's presentation will discuss topics such as how to assess your own publication impact and how to maximize your perceived worth, along with hints on how to effectively use the restrictive format of the application. I thought it would be a lovely icebreaker to introduce the lighter side of Professor Rybicki, who's our presenter today, by reading you the introduction section on his ResearchGate profile. This is what he said. I am 6 and aging disreputedly. I enjoy reading widely about science, teaching postgraduate virology and biotechnology, and trying vaccines and high-value reagents and biologics in plants and other expression systems. More generally, I enjoy family, red wine, photography, classic rock, and hard science fiction in that order. On a more serious note, Professor Rybicki is an NRF A-rated researcher and recognized by his peers as the leading international scholar in his field for the high quality and impact of his research outputs. He knows the NRF rating system exceptionally well and was a member of the UCT internal assessment panel for many years. This panel is the conduit or the middle category. So researchers apply for funding, and all applications is assessed and reviewed by this internal assessment panel. And this is a collection of academics from various disciplines who basically provides their feedback on the application, and this feedback is communicated to the applicant. So this is part of UCT's very stringent internal quality assurance process and how we support the rating application. So over to you, Ed.
Thanks very much, Roshan. Yeah, for my sins, I've done this a number of times, so you're going to get a presentation that's reasonably well worked out. And I see Linda Gale in the audience. I don't think you have anything to learn, Linda Gale, but relax. Okay, so why bother to get rated? In that there's increasingly criticism over the system and why one should bother to do it at all. So I'm going to outline why one should, and then give a couple of problems that may help you focus your applications. So why bother to get rated? Well, faculties at our university and other universities use it as a recognizing your research output for promotability. And now I see I've spelled promotability wrong. In other words, it's a really quick and really easy thing to look at somebody's CV when they're up for promotion, along with all of their other attributes, and then give them a number on the UCT internal rating scales for research, teaching, social engagement, and the rest. And for the research, the NRF rating is regarded as a very good proxy. However, this is coming under scrutiny, and they may de-emphasize this, but right now that's the status quo. Universities use it to assess how employable you are. You're much more poachable if you're A-rated or B-rated than if you're mid-C rated. This is very cynical, very mercenary, but it's a simple fact of life. And UCT uses it to determine whether or not to keep you on after retirement age. I'm 65. I'm supposed to retire at the end of this year. I've managed to use my rating to leverage the fact that I can now teach full-time and work full-time for the next 3 years until the end of my rating cycle, as it happens. So what are the problems with ratings? The first and fundamental problem is that ratings typically recognize deep, narrow achievements. In other words, not a wide range of interests. I tend to have a pretty wide range of interests. My good wife, Annalise Williamson, is probably even wider. This gets penalized. Wieland Gevers, when he was Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor at UCT, said that the NRF likes hedgehogs. They don't like foxes. Hedgehogs know one thing, and they know it very well. Foxes know many things and skitter from interest to interest. Now, if that happens to be successful in what you do, realize that the NRF and the way that it assesses people may not actually recognize this. So it's a really good idea to emphasize single or maybe a couple of things that you are really good at, and then push the rest not so much into the background as don't emphasize them as much. Because saying you're a world expert in two reasonably disparate things means that you could end up being assessed by two disparate bunch of referees, each of which says, well, I don't know anything about that, and then proceeds to say nice things about you on the thing that they know about. Because so multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity are not necessarily rewarded by NRF ratings. So be warned. And it can be a lottery, depending on the year, depending on the committee. A lot of people have got NRF fatigue when it comes to rating. This year, I've basically refused everything because I had so much on my plate, meaning that anybody who's relying on me to act as a referee for them isn't going to get me. And then they get people that may not know you very well. They may not necessarily know your subject that well, but they were picked out by bibliometrics, for example, as somebody who could reasonably be assumed to know who you are. If you don't, that actually could be a disadvantage. So it's a really good idea, and I'll emphasize it again now, so I'll get back to it again later, to make sure that your referees are willing up front to, or the ones that you would like to see your application, that they're willing up front to do it, because if they're not, you could have wasted a chance of getting something that you otherwise won't. Okay, so having done the doom and gloom, and add to the doom and gloom, it increasingly means nothing in terms of funding. I don't get any NRF funding. I haven't for some years. People in my team actually do. You cannot rely on it. The return for investment is so low at this point that it really does not mean a lot. Unless you have an NRF chair or you're in one of those ring-fenced areas like SKA or Tutuka or one of these other, the chances of you getting a competitive grant are decreasing by the year because the pot of money is decreasing. So is there a point in getting rated? Should we stop this seminar now? I do still think so, because if you're not in the game, you're not going to get any money. You do stand a chance of getting money out of the NRF. If you're not rated by them, you will get far less than if you are rated. For the reasons given above about proxies for promotability, how employable you are, etc. Recognition in the country is reasonably good. It's not that well recognized outside the country. You know, I'm an A-rated scientist. Well, yeah, what is that? Does that mean anything? Oh, in your country. So, yeah, it matters in South Africa. It doesn't matter a lot outside, but it does matter here. It is actually regarded as being a reasonably fair, impartial rating system with all of its warts and lesions. It is still actually worth doing. I sincerely hope that certain things that I'm going to criticize further in this seminar do get fixed. They have, in fact, fixed a few of the things I really used to drive me crazy, like all the fonts being too small and the fact you couldn't put any pictures in or format anything. But we'll get to that. So I've had a long history with the NRF. In fact, I think I may have been among the first people rated by the old FRD back in March of 1984. I've gone through P rating. I've had C rating for 2 cycles. I was 3 cycles of being rated B. And I eventually got rated A when I was actually to the point of throwing up my hands and saying, what the hell is the point of this? And then I got an A rating, and it seemed to be more rosy. The point is that recognition, if you're rated C2, for example, That means you are a good, solid scientist or researcher with international recognition. It does not mean you're mediocre. It means that you have international recognition, that you are on the way to somewhere, or that you've reached a reasonable peak in an area that you are regarded as being knowledgeable internationally. And then, of course, it goes up to the point where people say really nice things about you and you get a higher rating. It's worth keeping. It's worth following up with. It helps you, as I said, at the university and the national level, and it may get you some money. So given those caveats, let's wander on through. That's my sad history. Come along. And the wrongest thing about rating, in my opinion, is the rating form. I think it is a primitive, clumsy piece of rubbish that I have a 27-inch screen so that I can read the damn thing, because my eyesight isn't so good anymore. It really, really is an unfriendly interface. So basically do everything offline and then paste it in, because it really is a dreaded piece of rubbish. However, given that this is what we have, there are some very important things to take note of. There are major areas of personal input into the NRF rating application that can float or sink your application. They really are fundamentally important, and there's not that many of them. So it really, really is worth your while to take the maximum advantage of them that you can. First is the personal profile. The second is narratives in publications. I've seen people literally use 3 words when they've got to fill in that little bit in your publications, sort of comments on it. They use 3 words. Not a good plan. Somebody doesn't know your research area that well. If you don't say good things about your own publication, why should they think anything about them? The best research outputs in 8 years. There's a possibility of extended narratives. You can write little essays. There's only 5. You only get the chance of putting up 5 of your best publications in the last 8 years. You can write good things about your publication. Outputs from student supervision. This is looked at, the fact that you're training students, so-called capacity development, and that your students are publishing is noted with favor. So if you don't actually tell anybody about it, they don't know. Your best prior outputs. This is foundational material. This is where you came from if you've been in the rating system a while. If this is your first rating, then disregard. Or I beg your pardon, if it is your first rating, but you have a publication history that dates back longer than 8 years, this is really well worth taking notice of, because some of the same things I've said about the best research outputs apply to the prior outputs. Why was something foundational? Why was something that was cited 50 times in a field where people get 1,000 citations? Why was it fundamental, and why was it actually something that really matters? And you can say these things. Your completed research. This is an essay you get to write about what you've done in the last 8 years. This is not a place to complain. It's not even a place to explain so much. It is a place, however, that you can really get into what you did and what it means and where it's going. Self-assessment, and I put it in capitals, and I would have put it in twice, but I didn't have space. This is really important. Why do you think that the NRF should improve your rating or give you a rating at all? Why should other people think so? The people that read this assessment. We tend to, you've seen the comparison between an American nominating somebody for something and an English person nominating somebody for something. The American will say the best thing since sliced bread and invented the internet and whatever. The British person will say is a competent researcher. Don't just call yourself a competent researcher. If you genuinely have things that you have done that you are proud of, put them in. Do not damn yourself with faint praise, literally. because if you do that, nobody else will see any good reason to see how good you are. Your ongoing or planned research, more of the same is not a good idea. Where you plan to go and how exciting this is and how the previous 8 years have unlocked this is a good idea. You don't necessarily have to follow up on any of this. This is not a research proposal. This is where I am taking what I have done. And if referees are impressed by it, then you're going to get a better opinion from them than if they're not. That is exactly what a personal profile looks like off the god-awful NRF interface. However, this is what you should put in it. You give the best account of your career that you can, and don't use the third person. This is you getting rated. This is not you writing a reference for someone. So the best account of your career that you can, emphasizing local and international recognition, preferably focusing on just a few areas, but well. So, for example, in this evaluation cycle, my research is focused on vaccine related. This is a change from the previous cycle. I was on the edge of my seat for a while there, well, for about a year, in fact over a year, because that's how long it took them to give me my second last rating. And I had recently changed fields. So I went from something that I knew I was good at to something that I hoped I was becoming good at, but that awkward bridge between them, when you say decisively, I am changing from this to this. So for a while I had a dual focus, but then you say that in that change, right? For example, 7 of my 20 most cited articles since, and I can't even see the thing because the bloody controls are obscuring it. There you are. Included vaccines, for example, when I changed from from plant virology effectively and vaccinology to vaccinology only. So if there has been a change in career, explain it, but don't wave your hands and say, oh, what a pity it is you're working in South Africa and there's no money and the career advancement. Nobody cares. Honestly, they do not care. They don't care that you went to a rural school in far north of South Africa or in rural Zimbabwe or whatever. What they do care about is what you've done with what you've got. That is what the rating is about. And the rating is about the last 8 years, not your childhood schooling. So while it might be tempting to put in the things that you feel that you've got away from, not that good an idea. You only have, and my mind goes blank, I can't remember how many words you've got here. It's not that many. I think it's 1,100 characters or something stupid. So profile structure. The default option of the profiles, I think you can put in formatting now. I can't get into the site because I'm not getting rated right now. So I don't know what the absolute up-to-date site looks like. Put in spaces between your paragraphs, because when this thing comes out, in other words, when somebody prints it to look at it, you get something that looks like that. If that's the A4 page width, that ridiculously tiny font. And it just looks like a mass of text. And if somebody is faced with that, trying to read your way through it is actually a chore. Help them, break it up, do what paragraphs are meant to do, and then put space in between them to make it obvious that you're paragraphing. Put in early history and achievements. Like, for example, I was trained in classical plant virology, While I no longer work on Gemini virus diversity, that informed work that we do on another set of a new area of biotechnology, for example. So I'm going to detail stuff in the research accomplished and in the publications that you may as well explain where it came from, because I'm using modern biotechnology, but I'm using stuff that I worked on back in the 1980s, for example. It's worth saying where something comes from. What was the foundation for your present work, the work that you're reporting on in the last 8 years? So a little bit of history in the late 1990s, I started collaborating, and then this work led in 2005 to something that I now do as a full-time basis. Then, how good are you? You've explained where you come from, what the foundation was. How good do you think you are? This is where you put it. You get to put it about 3 different times. It's worth remembering this because that form leads you all over the place. But this is right up front. This is the profile. This is where you say how good you think you are. Like, for example, we've applied for patents. The research is focused on vaccine-related biotechnology, publications, etc., etc. Rating. Stick your H index in here if you can bring yourself to care about H indices. Put it in here. Put it in up front because it could get lost in the wash in all of the chaos that is the rest of this rating form. Put it up front where you know that people are going to be reading something. Put up your signal achievements, as in guest editor for an invited set of reviews. You've had how many plenary lectures in the last 4 years, this sort of thing. Then publications. You get to, the whole thing is about publications basically. So you should mention, because again, the form is a piece of rubbish. They're not, your publications are not numbered. So tell them, in the last 8 years, I've had 72 publications, 10 Nature articles, whatever, because otherwise they've got to go through your publications one by one and look for them. Now, some of us, and I look to my medical colleagues in the field of HIV in particular, without mentioning names, Linda Gale Becker, have probably got about 150 papers in the last 8 years. Now, some referee will actually go and look at those and see, oh, wow, yes, hey, I've seen that one. But it is chaos. This is where you get to say something about them. Sorry, the personal profile is where you get to say something about them. But in your publications, you get to say things as well. So, for example, that is what the peer-reviewed articles and such section looks like in the form. It really is extraordinarily tedious, although they do say that you can pull things in via the search engines these days. You still have to fill in a whole lot of boxes for every single publication. So, for example, we've got here author's reference, web address, and then own contribution. Now, this is where you actually get to show. Turn your cell phones off. This is where you get to show that what you did. You may be part of a team, big team. I know that this has actually worked against certain people in terms of, well, you know, they're part of a team. We can't see where their individual contribution is. In your personal profile, you get to say what you have done. In this publication section, you get to say what you did for every single paper. And for example, I hosted a student, I supervised them locally, and I helped write. I'm not the main author, but where I think I am, I say so. I make it absolutely clear. Like main supervisor, planned the research, final edit and submission. Supervised, wrote, submitted. You can use formulae like owner of research. So in other words, this was my research project, although other people may have helped supervise it. You know, I came up with the idea and I got the funding for it. So that tells people what it is that you did. So you put everything in. Your 8-year record of publication, put all of them in. Emphasize your contributions clearly and succinctly. And your contributions are around the topics of grant ownership. I got the money that enabled this, that I am an author on. Student supervision. I was the main, or I was the co-supervisor of the student, or I was the external supervisor of a student, and you know, I'm a minor contributor to a paper. Is this my own research? So I'm not just lending my name because I gave an opinion and did some consulting to somebody else for a paper. This is my own research area in my group. Writing. Did you write the paper? Were you responsible for supervising writing the paper? Did you just contribute a section to a review or a paper written by someone else? Then submission. This is a reasonably good indicator of ownership. Did you submit that paper, especially in the scientific disciplines? Yes, I submitted this. I was the corresponding and responsible author. And then, Roshan, it's working quite well, but I've got this thing across the bottom of my screen which completely blocks what I'm trying to do. Beg your pardon. I can actually do that somewhere else. Here's where you get to game the system slightly. And this is not being crooked. This is just being cynical and exploiting advantage where you can find it. On these sections, you get to, if you believe in impact factors, if you cynically believe in impact factors like I do, because they still impress people. If you put something in a journal with an impact factor of 6 or 42 or something, this means something to the people in your field that are reviewing you. And if this is not where you're at, and you can put in number of citations, even though this was only published in, this was published in 2014, it has 50 citations already. This is a really good indicator that this paper has actually meant something. But this is the modern age. The fact that people are reading what you wrote is also a good indicator, especially outside of the hard sciences, where something that you write might have actually influenced policy, that it's become required reading for a course, for example, where you'll get no citations, but 100 people a year in one course will read that thing. So that's number of accessions to published material on the web. And if you've got something that's been accessed 10,000 times in the last 5 years, it's worth putting it in because it's a measure. So-called, it's an altmetric, if you like. Then put in comments like, this review is one of my best cited papers. And it is extensively used for teaching, which is something I picked up on because I looked at the number of accesses, which is way more than the number of citations. And then somebody said they're using it for teaching their students biotechnology. I mean, wow, cool. So you are actually contributing outside of the formal publication, formal citing area. It's worth putting it in. And for example, stick in impact factor, but, and this is a but, it increasingly means nothing what the impact factor is. And if you look at engineering, for example, there's a lot of their journals have very low impact factors. I once said something about, well, this isn't nuclear physics. Somebody says, no, you don't understand. Nuclear physics, the highest rated journal, has got an impact factor of about 3. This is compared to dedicated journals like Cell, for example, in biomedical sciences, which got an impact factor of about 35. The point is, what is the norm in your field? And what is increasingly becoming the norm is it doesn't matter where the hell you publish because people can find it, wherever it is. I've just been woken up to the fact recently that something I wrote in 1990 as a result of a seminar discussion that ended up in South African Journal of Science because I couldn't think that anybody else wanted it. That inspired people as far away as Sydney and Halifax in Newfoundland to actually do certain kinds of work. And it's still being cited 30 years on because people are interested in the subject matter. You can get to this stuff these days. It doesn't matter where it is, and it doesn't matter as long as it's available on the web. So something that's accessed over 11,000 times in a low impact journal. I think the journal was very happy with that, for example, and I was, because it meant that people were actually reading the thing. If, on the other hand, you'd like to brag a little bit, well, there you are, scientific reports, impact factor 5.6. That's equal to the highest ranked virology journal, it's Journal of Virology. What did I do? I was the contribution or project owner. I was the originator of the project. I was co-supervisor of the work and co-equal senior author. I've left absolutely no doubt. And who's ever making noise in the background, could you stop that? It's kind of echoing badly. So Kenzie, I think that might be you. You need to mute your microphone. Originated, co-supervised, co-equal senior author. I put my footprints all over this paper. It is mine. And things that you are really proud of, do that. Conferences, invited talks. I've been to enough conferences that I don't even bother listing them anymore because it really does become tedious. And unlike electrical engineering or other branches of engineering or computer science, for example, we do not go in for refereed submissions that actually end up with a DOI and can be cited. You know, they're just in a conference proceedings book. However, when you are in those disciplines and when these things are important, because there could be one of the major avenues of publication, like for computer science, which I discovered when my son did computer science. But for a short while, there were two Rybickis publishing at UCT. I think his paper got more attention than mine that year. It is really important to list where you were invited, that where you were a guest lecturer, that you were an invited contribution, and especially if it's something like a keynote or a plenary. And there's various ways of wording these things, and there's a couple of sections that you can actually put these papers in. But it really is well worth recording, especially the things that you presented by invitation, or especially where there were plenaries, because that is very good instant assessment of your international recognition. So you end up with a referee that doesn't know you that well because they're peripheral to your field. And this happens quite often because of reviewer fatigue. Oh, wow, he was a plenary speaker at the World Congress of Pharmacology or Electrical Engineering Congress in Denver or whatever. Invited plenary scientific committees of these sorts of things. This is also measures of worth. And this is what this whole rating thing is about, is what is the measure of your worth, effectively, in research in this country. But also, what is your international recognition like? And this is where conferences, invited talks are actually really important. Plenary lectures, invited talks, keynote address, and published abstracts, obviously. Then in the general section on conferences, list your conference talks and posters, because, and I know people who haven't done this at all and get stuck at a sort of lowish rating. And then when by advice they showed how many international conferences they and their students actually went to, people started noticing, oh, wow, yes, they contributed 3 papers at that conference. I was at that conference. Oh, great, I saw that poster, in fact. These things are worth something, because if you're contributing at an international conference, when you're especially an emerging researcher, you're just starting to make a name, you've got first couple of international conferences you've been to, you've got a talk. I mean, wow, that's quite cool with a big conference. You're presenting a poster, well, you're along with a lot of other people, but you're at an international conference. This is how people notice you and how your work gets noticed. Patents. This is not something that people, but UCT is increasingly, due to some kicking and screaming by a number of people, including me, starting to recognize the worth of patents, both in terms of promotability at UCT, in other words, and a partial recognition of your research worth. The Research Contracts and Innovation Office at UCT keeps a list of all patents done through UCT. They've got all of the documentation you want, and it's NRF friendly in terms of the way they formatted it. So it's not a chore to get hold of this information to put it in. It's worth it. It shows that your research is translatable, that it can actually potentially have some kind of commercial application. And you get to say things like you have licensed this technology to GlaxoSmithKline, or to, I see Gerald's in the audience, to somebody who makes things go boom. It's, again, evidence of recognition for somebody, and you're always catering for that somebody who doesn't know you well that's on your review panel, to say, okay, this is impressive. This is not something that I knew much about. So an important part of recognition, RC&I keeps track and works with the NRF to actually establish the format to include them. So it's relatively painless these days. Other recognized research outputs. Here's where, did you organize an international workshop on Shakespeare? Did you organize an international workshop on, Gerald, sorry, I'm stuck on you, explosives, biotechnology, plant virology, whatever. You get to put that in here. Again, evidence of recognition. If people trust you enough to put you on the scientific advisory panel or organizing committee, especially, of an international conference, fantastic. This is good recognition. It's good evidence to other people of your recognition. Are you organizing important local conferences? This is evidence of your local recognition. This is important at the starting out stages of getting rated. You're going for the very first rating. Having this kind of evidence that you're actually involved in doing things like this is really valuable. Additional details information. It used to be just H-index. I notice now you get a variety of ways of presenting your H-index. Web of Science, Scopus, and Google. Now, don't spurn Google, especially if you're in the humanities, in EBE or computer science, because they keep track of contributions that have been published in some of the most obscure places that you would believe, and importantly, in important areas where the other bibliometric servers don't. So published abstracts, for example, Scopus is reasonably useless at it, and so is Web of Science. Google is really good. Google's really good for picking up stuff in other languages, but I'll get to that more later. So put in a Google H-index, put in a relevant link to it and the date it was drawn, because it does actually matter. People will tell you, oh, well, you know, H-indexes mean nothing. Well, yeah, they do. Have you got a reasonably large H-index? Yes, well, that means that people are citing your work. In an area where citations are not as important, then this isn't as important. But that's where Google comes in again. And I'll say a few words about altmetrics later. Then this is where you get serious. This is a serious chance to impress. You've got to put up your best research outputs in the last 8 years. You only put in 5. But you have a motivation where you can put in actually quite a lot of text as to why you're motivating that this is one of your best research outputs from the last 8 years. You can do things like saying this was 3-way collaboration, international collaboration between my group, a company, and somebody in Germany, our technology, somebody else's gene, somebody's peptide, and it puts up a viable cancer therapy. Then, if you really want to gouge the system a little, you put in the alt metrics. This is where the alt metrics come in handy. And you ask, what is an alt metric? Well, really go Google that. Very well worth knowing, because a lot of the journals actually put up the alt metrics for the papers that they publish. So, for example, I can say authoritatively, because I went to the website and looked at it, article is in the 76th percentile of all, that's 4.8 million articles tracked by altmetrics. And it had 2,734 accesses. And this is 5 years after it got published. Whoop. So, for example, BMC cancer has got a reasonable impact factor, not that people are getting very snotty about impact factors, but believe me, a lot of other people still rate them as being quite important. It hadn't got many citations, but it had been accessed a lot. In altmetrics terms, this thing was actually rather high. And here's one that we put up. We put it in the South African Journal of Science for the simple reason that we were doing research that was aimed at establishing a local technology base to make influenza vaccines. So I thought it was an appropriate place to put it. Also, given that it's on the web, you can't lose it there. No, people can find it from wherever you like. So we put this up. It's not a particularly well-cited paper. It's not a high-ranking journal. You can do this. You don't have to slavishly say, well, only my higher-cited papers must go in. You put the things in that you can make a good case for being foundational for future work, for example. So this paper, well, the work provided the basis for a patent that we've licensed to a company that brings in income for something like the last 8 years now. We've also used it as leverage for motivating for local manufacture of vaccines in South Africa. These are all things that you can put into the motivation for the paper that you're putting up as being one of your best. So I won't bore you with the detail, but for example, funding in 2005 to patent application in 2006 to publication in 2012. And we have worldwide patent priority for that gene, which happens to be potentially pandemic H5N1 influenza. More chance to shine, best outputs. Make sure you use the space to really say why this is good. Again, this was a foundational technology that hadn't been cited that many times, but the important thing was it formed a basis for a patent application as well, which is also licensed to an international company. And it was foundational in terms of nobody else had actually made this technology work before. So that was our foundation for the next 10 years of work. And this is where you look at something like, for example, this is a paper that I will not tell you what it was, but notice that it was in Nature in September 2011. It's got an altmetric score of 363. This is astronomical. Now, this can also reflect negative opinion. And some people may know what I'm talking about, but this does reflect some negative opinion. But this is where you get the scores from, in the journal, where you've got where your article is. There's very increasingly these days, there is an altmetric score that you can get to, which tells you, like, for example, this thing was tweeted by 289 people. It was in the 99th percentile of tracked articles of a similar age in all journals. And this is Nature we're talking about. It happens to be a one-page science fiction story, but it was in Nature. And it's a 98th percentile of 894 tracked articles of a similar age. These are things you can boast about. And given that, for example, anything that involves formation of opinions about policy, which is where NGO and humanities and the like, where a lot of that impact happens. So you can do things like track newspaper mentions of an article. Where you don't get formal citations of something, this is actually good evidence that people are taking notice of something, that it's actually forming a base for people to make policy from. That can be important in areas of medicine and such as well. Then you get things like publication stats that also come out of a journal. I think this was actually out of, brain goes dead again. What's that? ResearchGate. There you go. ResearchGate, if you put articles up on ResearchGate, it lets you track them. So you can see over what sort of period people were reading your thing. And I think this is reasonably shortly after I published this thing. It had already had 2,478 reads. And it was ResearchGate. And I know it was being used for teaching because people actually corresponded with me and told me so, which accounted for why it had so many reads. Here's another one. Article in Scientific Reports. It had altmetric of 21 shortly after publication. What is that 21? Drill down on the journal and find out that it's not got that many citations, but it's getting a lot of online attention picked up by news outlets, for example. Again, this is worth mentioning. You have written something that has, sorry, clumsy cat in the background. This is something that you wrote that news media are paying attention to. Again, especially important in areas where formal citation is not a big deal, but the fact that people who influence policy read it is important. So again, altmetric score, 92nd percentile of similar age, 87th percentile of articles similar age in scientific reports, which rapidly became quite a reputable journal. And mentioned in blogs and in Google Plus while it still existed, and this sort of thing. Down on the bottom right there, you can see altmetric attention score, citations, and where and what and how and what ranking this article is in the world and in that particular journal. So in other words, if you've got an article that is in the bottom 25th percentile of anything that was ever published in that journal, you may not want to say something about it. If, on the other hand, it is in the top 75 or higher percentile, it is worth mentioning. So leverage altmetrics. Leverage altmetrics for the commentary that you put into your best publications. Then best research outputs from student supervision in the last 8 years. You've already got all of these things in your publication lists. But now in humanities, for example, and I know in the English department, you tend to throw something at a student and then meet them when they've written up a thesis and not have your name on something that they publish. On the other hand, you can claim the credit for having supervised them, for having given them the topic in the first place, and cite that this person under my supervision wrote something, a single author publication that has revolutionized the field of modern American poetry, whatever. Go, modern American critical thinking about poetry. Put down what your students have published, because it marks A, that your students publish, B, how many students you've got that are publishing, and C, the fact that you mentor students well enough that they can actually publish something. It is worth noting, and it does, reviewers do look at this because it's, again, it's a reasonably convenient thing to look at, unlike the publication list, the big publication list, that they can actually get an impression from. You put in the odd comment, for example, like somebody writes that this was an important contribution and an extremely good MSc for one of our students. So how good your student training is, how often they publish on what, and how good that is, well worth noting. Then best research outputs prior to the last 8 years. A lot of people pay no attention. They've got this list and it's more than 8 years old, and that does matter. And again, you get applicants' contribution at the bottom where you can write stuff. You can say this was foundational for, first, to show that GAG-derived polypeptides larger than P24 could be expressed in plants, and that you could potentially make HIV vaccines in plants. So what did you do? Well, co-wrote, submitted, senior author, owned the research, whatever. And again, thousands of accesses at the site. So go and look at the site. So don't forget about it just because it was 9 odd years ago. Go back to the publication site and you might get pleasantly surprised at how many people are looking at something like this. Here's another, for example. I could make the point here that peak citations were in 2013. So this was a sleeper. This was a paper that got published that wasn't noticed much. And then 5 odd years after it was published, so in other words, outside of the area that you're getting assessed on, this thing had peak citations. So what did this do? Well, it showed that our lab was established as a successful group, etc., and that we improved levels of production of a protein. It's worth saying it. It really is. And here, because you get quite a lot of words to say something about your completed research. Brief description of completed research, but I think it's 15,000 characters. It's one of the longest sections that you can actually write. Worth putting in the kitchen sink here. So in other words, say what it is you've done, 11,000 characters. And remember that these things are with spaces when you come to pasting stuff from Word into this stupid, stupid form. Say what it is you've done. Succinctly explain your research. You may have marginal non-experts refereeing you. Emphasize your contribution if you're part of a team. Highlight collaborations, and especially international collaborations. National collaborations, well, obviously you have national recognition. International collaborations, you have international recognition. And somebody who's marginally outside your field can look at that and say, oh, I know about that lab. That's quite impressive. And remember, when you write this thing, you've got stuff that could be in press. You don't get to include that in the publications, but you get to include it here. You've got 3-4 papers in press that were too late for, or they're not published formally yet, so you can't put them in the publication list. Here it is. Here's stuff that is churning, shows that your production level keeps on going, even though, here's the assessment has come and gone. Collaborations, local collaboration, EU FP7 collaboration, collaborating with the state-of-the-art research group in the UK, world leaders. We collaborate with them. People will notice this and say, okay, not bad at all. Extras. Put in stuff with links in it. This is a little bit of a trick in that gets you, there's 11,000 characters. You can't put in a whole big section on patents, but you can put in evidence of our regular application for patents on discoveries and processes, and here's the link. You can set up a link to the ESPASnet, which is the European Patent Office, for example, with all the search terms in it that will return your patents only, for an immediate user-friendly as opposed to what is on the form. And you can do this with publications. So, for example, you can put a link to your Google profile, your Google Scholar profile, and get a much more friendly list of publications that is actually up to date compared to the rubbish that they make you put into this form. The rubbish that they make you put into this form is valuable because you get to write something about your contribution. That's where it's important, though. And for example, that link leads straight to here. Self-assessment. This is blow your own trumpet time. This is where you get to talk about you and what you have done. So my research group has done X, Y, Z. A measure of my international recognition is that I'm being asked to write review articles. I recently was an invited co-editor. My publishing impact has continued to increase steadily, etc. My group's major contributions since 2009 are: be honest, but not too modest. Do not be British here. Be verging on the American. Tell people why you're good, and especially highlight, if you're an emerging researcher, what your local collaborations are, and if you're established, what your international, well, put them in anyway, but for an established researcher, it's important to know what your international impact is, and summarize your advancement of your field. As in, my group is among the world leading in the field of, and why that is so. So, for example, put in that my publishing impact has continued to increase steadily, because this is not necessarily noticeable in terms of numbers. The NRF rating is fairly useless on putting the numbers in. It's difficult to find. So put them in for people. Make it so they don't have to go look for it. Roshan, sorry. Apologies, there's something dreadfully allergenic in the air right now. So lay it out concisely for people. You've got 172 Scopus listed publications, an H index of whatever, and this many citations. By comparison, last time you got rated, if you've been rated before, put it out. I only had 130 publications the previous time I got rated. So there's obviously a net increase of 42 in the rating period. My group's major achievement since 2009, which was the last rating, is the rating period, a consolidation of our expertise in so lay it out short and concise. This is what we have done. And other measures of my research impact. This is where you get to use altmetrics again. So, for example, been cited 16 times, but read 16,000 times. And actually publicizing your own publications via Twitter and via blogs actually knocks up their citation rate and their reading rate. So it's well worth doing. And put a summary in. What is it that you actually believe that you have managed to do? In summary, I believe that I and my research group consolidated our position as a world-leading lab in the special niche area of. So we're not leading HIV vaccine research. We are not leading the application of making better electric batteries or whatever. So better batteries for cars. We have done something in a reasonably niche area, which is what the NRF likes, and we are now leading it in our opinion. If the referee agrees with you, then you're fine. If the referee thinks, well, this trumpet is being blown a little too loud, that's where don't go completely overboard. I've seen people literally say that they're running a completely world-leading lab in all areas, and you look at them and you think, no, you're not. So don't blow too hard if you don't know how to blow the trumpet well. What is your ongoing and planned research? 5,000 characters, including spaces, unless they've improved the system. Briefly detail what you're doing right now. You just talked about things that you've done in the previous 8 years. What are you doing right now? List your projects, go into detail what you concretely plan to do. Describe some details. Say, we are planning to engage in making an African horse sickness virus vaccine and testing it in horses, etc., because it'll show that you're taking what you have done somewhere. You're moving it on up and out, sort of to higher things. Emphasize new international collaborations and contacts. For example, put in the international collaborative projects and where they're funded from, because evidence of funding from international sources is really rather useful. And I might, at this point, I'll point out that NRF bilateral grants with other countries, they generally only give you money for travel and or having a little workshop or something. They don't fund anything much at all. If you do not happen to be in the wet sciences, then you don't actually need the equipment or reagent money. But having people come to your place and then being able to collaborate with them has been extraordinarily valuable to us. So we've leveraged smallish grants with different people in different countries into collaborations that have spanned years and have actually got publications going, just as an aside, as being one way of leveraging something out of the NRF. Reviewers, who do you want to review your thing? Don't use friends or colleagues. I repeat, do not use friends or colleagues. These will immediately be disqualified by the NRF rating panel. Do not use exclusively local people. Do use respected international authorities and appropriate international peers, and good, i.e. respected, locals. So don't ask a Nobel Prize winner, if you're an emerging researcher, to be a reviewer because they won't even reply. Don't ask a senior professor at the university in Bonn if you're an emerging researcher, because again, they'll look at this and think, oh, well, yeah, I'm not interested. Do ask peers. Ask somebody that's at or above your achievement level. You are just cracking into the international literature. Find somebody that you consider fairly exciting that's doing the same sorts of things you are, and get them as a reviewer and ask them if they will be willing to review. This is not frowned on. It's a really good idea to have a panel of reviewers because it saves the NRF having to struggle to find people. And literally, they can go for 9 months trying to assemble a decent review panel for somebody if they haven't been provided a decent list of names. So no friends or colleagues, and you have to list what is your relationship with this reviewer. And if you've collaborated extensively with somebody internationally, it's not a good idea to use them. Do not use exclusively local people unless you're in a very, very, very niche area in which the only authorities in the world happen to be in South Africa. Use respected people and use peers. Don't go stepping too far up and out of your bailiwick. Make sure you attach your 5 best recent papers, because otherwise the review panelists have got to go look for them. And they can now, well, get an impression out of what they've put into this form. They may actually benefit from reading your papers that you have attached. At which point, Roshan, I think we can take a pause and deal with some questions, because I do have another 17 slides to go, potentially. I do see it's 11 o'clock. And Roshan, how much longer have we got?
Well, the seminar is until 11:15.
50.
11:15. So another 15. Well, another 13 minutes.
Are there any questions in the chat room? More hands up.
Okay, so Ed, Yumna Albertus, right, sorry.
Say again?
So I see there's a question, can you add articles written for newsletters? And what's your thoughts on mentioning preprints?
Preprints stand in the same sort of space as, sorry, in press. Although, you know, they haven't been accepted by a journal, but I've seen people put articles in preparation in. So it's you don't want to have 30 articles with no evidence. And although having it up as a preprint is actually rather useful, because then the reviewer can go look at it. So yes, I think put in preprints where they're relevant. I've tested these waters for the first time this year, for example, and we've actually had some really nice feedback from people, and we can actually put it up there as evidence that we were among the first people to do something. So yes, articles written for newsletters. Depends on exactly what the NRF asks for, evidence of peer review and the like. You can put in policy documents and reports, for example. I know a couple of people from UCT whose rankings were in fact determined on the basis of the 500 or so reports that they'd written for government, which actually influence policy in fisheries, for example. So yes, there is place for things for articles in newsletters. I certainly put in a couple of things. In fact, I tend to put in the kitchen sink, which included science fiction short stories in Nature and and one other place. If it is a serious thing that was written in a newsletter, that is published, that is distributed, yes, it's something that is evidence of what it is that you have done. Okay, so what I could do is quickly whip through. Highly cited perspective article is, Gregory Smith is asking, I've certainly put in a review as one of my best research outputs, in that it's my 3rd most highly cited article. It'd be stupid not to. And it's something, you wrote it because you're an expert in the field. It's evidence that you're an expert in the field. So yes, most certainly. And okay, Roshan, shall I dash through a quick comparison of Google, Scopus, and...
Yeah, I don't see anyone's hands up, so I think you can proceed, Ed. Thanks.
Okay, I'll go quite fast. Auto-Googling, in other words, Googling yourself and why you should. Also, more formally, citation metrics for self-advancement. Auto-Googling needs some setting up because you really should have a Google Scholar profile. It's reasonably easy. You just got to train Google what things are yours and what are not yours. Once you've set it up, you have a profile, you've got all of the articles that you've managed to source, and Google will go out and look for them once it knows what your address and name and preferred initials and nickname and whatever are. And then you can screen things and toss them out. Then it learns very quickly what is yours and how to find it, and then automatically updates. So that you then have a publication profile that you don't have to update, you just have to approve. That gives you useful things like H-index, I-10 index, 5-year H-index. So this is gaming H-indices in a way, in that your lifetime H-index is your achievements over, in my case, since 1981. 5-year H-index is what impact the stuff that you have had in the last 5 years, which is a much better measure of whether you're still being productive if you're a well-established scientist, for example. Now, once you set it up, you get that information. All you need is a Gmail address for sign-in, Google Scholar citations as to what your papers. You can immediately see your H-index. You can see your 5-year H-index, which is a good measure of recent impact. And people who've heard of Publish or Perish, housing.com. This is a non-science-based, as in, well, I lied, it tracks electrical engineers and computer scientists and the like, but it's very much more used by the humanities. It uses Google Scholar, and I think the reasonably short-lived Microsoft Academic Search. It then analyzes these and gives you a whole lot of metric, but the engine that drives it is Google Scholar. So these two actually work rather well together. So people say, oh, well, you can't use Google, you've got to use Publish or Perish. That's where Publish or Perish gets its information from. And it may be best for things like business, administration, finance, economics, engineering, comp sci, maths, social sciences, arts, and humanities. ISI, Web of Knowledge, Web of Science is pretty much state of the art. It's more clunky than Scopus in my opinion, but that's just my opinion. The useful thing is that it interfaces immediately with EndNote. And if you've got any sense, you're using EndNote to do your, you could use Mendeley, for example, but EndNote is free at UCT. You can get the desktop app as well as the web app, and everything that comes out of Web of Knowledge, and in fact Scopus, can be made EndNote friendly. Insights is another tool that UCT libraries now have. It's from the same stable as Web of Science. It lets you benchmark your output against peers worldwide, where you're going for the best rating that you can get, and you think that you've done really good stuff in the last 8 years and the years prior to that, that you set up a unique area of research. This is where you find out how you rate. This requires a librarian or somebody who knows how to use it, though. And here we are, Web of Science. How can you search? Well, stick your name in, get something out, get all of this data. You can do a lot of different things like searching within your results, limiting it to a certain number of years, create a citation report, save to EndNote online, take a look and edit. You can use Boolean logic in the search terms, for example, which is very useful for excluding stuff as well as including stuff that otherwise might not get there. But it's useful in terms of creating an analysis, and that gives you, that's 117 publications out of Web of Science. It tells you from 1991, for example, what my citations are. And you can see what the H-index was at the time, what the average citations per item are, which is rather interesting because that's something that you can say, this many people cite everything that I write on average. And you can do things like get this information out of it, which gives you citations per year. So if you really want to get in and mess with it, you can export this as Excel spreadsheets and do a lot of analysis on it, or save to text file or spreadsheet. Scopus. I like Scopus much better than I like Web of Science. It will look for Ed Rybicki, whereas Web of Science until recently didn't do that. I had to put Rybicki, comma, space, E.P. And then I'd lose all the E alone or Eds and that kind of thing. Where Scopus will look for all of that because I've trained it, who's me compared to anyone else. And again, you can get patents out of Scopus. If you've got patent records that don't appear usefully in Web of Science, you'll almost certainly find them in Scopus. And you can go do your patent search. You can have a look at all of the documents you have and refine it. Look in the last 5 years only, for example. And then all the various export, download, citation overview, and that kind of thing. Clunky citation overview, not as pretty as the Web of Science one, but it gives you a lot of data, all the citations in all of the years. So you can do a lot of decent analysis on that. Say in this 8-year period, I have been cited this many times, or these records have been cited consistently for the last 25 years, whatever. Then Google. It is rather interesting that Scopus corresponds best with Google Scholar citations for papers. So if you're worried about, well, you know, Google's not that authoritative, Scopus gives you the best equivalence, if you like, for what Google does. Google finds things in foreign languages and newspapers, but Scopus and Web of Science do not. Really useful if you happen not to be in the hard sciences. And with that, $10 if you can tell me what the show is. I have spoken. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. That was excellent. Pumbla has asked a question. She wants to know if ResearchGate metrics are useful.
Yes, I showed you a slide of mine from the downloads, the accesses to a paper that I put up in ResearchGate, which is how I found that something that wasn't cited very much was actually being downloaded incredibly actively, which is subsequently I found out that it's being prescribed to 3 different universities as teaching material. It's worth finding out this kind of thing. And to Yumna, no, that was The Mandalorian, which is in the Star Wars universe, but yeah. Told you I like science fiction.
I don't know if there's any other questions from anyone.
Thanks, Linda Dale.
Okay.
Thanks, Roshan. I'm glad we've got the technology sorted out. I couldn't get Teams to work on my computer, so I had to go in via the web.
You did very well, Ed. Thank you. And there's no further questions. That means everyone understood you very clearly. Very succinct. Thanks, Ed.
I don't know, just as a word, the panel, I said I couldn't do it this year, but now if individuals want the odd comment on rating application, that is in the kind of area that I work in, I'd be willing to give them a quick advice.
I'm going to note that. Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Greg.
And thanks everyone for attending. Please contact myself, Rushan Sunday, or Jackie Sylvester if you have any questions about the rating project.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Roshan.
Pleasure. Thanks. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.